1 Mile Over by Richard L. Elsliger. Before the advent of dawn, I stand in this putrid potter's field, a castigated reprobate, now living with what might be my last moments. A roiling sense of abject terror permeates my mental faculties and fills me with dread. I fear that I have but little time left to tell the circumstances that landed me in this situation, from which I have no apparent hope to extricate myself. I left my office on Friday afternoon in anticipation of a pleasant long weekend drive through the most rural areas I could find beyond my pedestrian place of residence, a place far out of sight from any work obligations, an asphalt nirvana for drivers. I removed the silken cover from my Lamborghini, a Countach from the 1980s, my celebratory car that memorialized my success and my place in the world. She was my poster car, and I was her poster child. The car cover crumpled to a heap on the floor, and the white paint gleamed under the artificial lights. Seeing the Lamborghini revealed again from beneath her silken robe, the exotic body design reminded me why I bought that car. I opened the garage door to the afternoon sun and stepped in behind the wheel. The seat comforted me in a way inexplicable to anyone unfamiliar with exotics or possessed of a general obsession with specialty cars and antiques. My plan was to drive into the heart of the rural countryside in search of automotive knickknacks and old gas station signs to complement my already abundantly decorated garage. I inserted the key and fired the engine. All 12 cylinders sang a chorus of combustion behind my head, and I sat on the ledge of the open door to back the car out, the visibility of the Countach so terrible that this technique proved essential when reversing from a parked position. I tolerated such idiosyncrasies quite well, much like one might tolerate certain strange attributes of an old friend. The old Lamborghini, if she could speak, would praise her release into the light of day in fanatical anticipation of a run through the gears to devour the open road at speed. The engine hummed a threatening idle, and though aged and slow by comparison to the most modern lineal descendants of the Lamborghini marque, she still sounded and appeared ominous merely by her stance in the driveway. I closed the garage and paused behind the wheel to map out my route. I did one lap around my circular driveway and rolled down the snaking path that led me to the street. The V12 engine growled with sensuous approval at our excursion to the unknown, and my mind swooned with desire to acquire some singular time away from the endless boardroom meetings. I rejoiced at the sound of my Lamborghini engine, her spinning camshafts and massive rotating crankshaft propelling the rear wheels, driving me in the direction of intrigue. I made no plans to stop the drive. I depended on the uncertain currents of fate to guide me to the unknown. I still maintained my secondary objective, to pick up a few antique Petroliana artifacts within the walls of old, dusty antique dealers along the way. The real enjoyment was the journey more than the destination, though I considered a rare piece of gas station memorabilia to be the pinnacle ending to a great day. I left behind my town in the rearview mirror and drove for a good 2 hours toward an adjoining state when a chain of mountains materialized in my windshield, unfamiliar behemoths that sprouted from the landscape, a temptation to test my driving prowess against the treachery of a snaky mountain road cut through the lofty terrain. Mountains possessed a certain mystique about them, their very nature a throwback over millions of years, and I pondered what secrets they held within their core. In an unexpected instant, my 4-lane road narrowed to 2 lanes, while I drew ever closer to a mountainous drive. Equally unexpected was the sudden disappearance of any traffic. No cars approached, and none followed. I owned the road now, having paid nothing for the privilege of said ownership, and wondered about the conspicuous absence of any other bidders to claim their stake. I picked up the pace and shoved the ramrod shifter through the well-used gated slots. The carburetors with certain greed slurped at the high test octane, leaving me with the mildest whiff of hydrocarbons, a sharp but not unpleasant attack on my senses. It smelled of perpetual motion. My driving shoes hugged the pedals, and the throttle response proved instantaneous. The visceral experience overwhelmed me, and all the problems I ever possessed had just evaporated into the mist of my subconscious. I pressed on, Higher in elevation I climbed, the road twisting in tight hairpins and switchbacks, testing my driving abilities to the maximum. My Lamborghini, she pressed on, never disappointing in her responsiveness to this mountain's every challenge. I'd not encountered anything like it, and the higher I climbed, the more threatening the weather taunted. Black clouds moved in and raindrops dotted my windshield. I activated my wiper and the massive blade executed a broad sweep across the angular and sloped windshield, eliminating the meteorological threat to my driving enjoyment. The nearer I drew to the summit, the more the inclement weather intensified. I had to slow down or risk skidding over an embankment. I downshifted and my hands uncomfortably gripped the steering wheel. I wasn't far from the summit, but beyond the crest I could see the sun. I made my way through 2 more hairpin turns and I arrived at the peak. The storm clouds dissipated and a strong sun beat down upon the valley below. I pulled over to an observation point and reined in the 12 angry bulls directly at my head, silencing them with a flick of the wrist. I pushed on the scissor door and climbed out to take a better look. A winding mountain road descended to the other side toward the valley, a road with equal grandeur comparable to my ascent, and the road appeared quite dry and inviting. The village in the distance looked quaint, and I wondered what antiques I might acquire during a brief stopover. Without hesitation, I returned to the driver's seat of my Countach and fired the engine. She roared her approval and we merged onto the blacktop. We wound our way over the writhing road at speed, threading the needle of this elaborate stitch pattern cut into the rock. In 15 minutes I reached the bottom and patted the dash of the old girl, signaling my approval of her performance to adhere to the asphalt and not get me killed with a tumble down a cliff. I shifted up to second gear, gaining speed through the valley before an S-curve slowed me down again. I moved past a stationary police cruiser obscured by tall grass off to the shoulder. A shock traveled through me, that fear of being caught by the law, and I wondered if he'd nailed me on radar or perhaps a laser. Instant recall flashed a posted speed limit in my mind of 55 before the curve, and my speedometer read 56. I gave a cursory check of my rearview mirror and saw no movement of the cruiser, and it vanished from my sight in the next curve. The town in my field of vision, I slowed to a more pedestrian pace, and that is when I saw the intermittent flashing of blue and red lights capture my attention from behind. I reduced my speed, pulled over at the town limits, and killed the engine. I could not imagine that he had stopped me for 1 mile per hour over the limit. No doubt he wanted to check out my car, and this would not have been the first time I'd been pulled over for such an event. The car was the star. The officer stopped me at my driver's window and knocked. I lowered the race-inspired slot window in response, limited to but a few inches of open space, wide enough to feed me a speeding ticket and no more. "Open your window more," he demanded. "I'm sorry, but I can't. This is how they designed it." "How they designed it," he echoed with a certain amount of disgust. "I'll be back. Don't go anywhere." He retreated to his cruiser, and I watched him from the scant view of the back window and my side mirrors. He worked his computer, or so it seemed, and then re-emerged from his squad car and approached. "Please step out of the car," he said. "What for?" I asked. "We can do this the hard way or the easy way," he said. I did not appreciate this sudden roadside escalation, but complied rather than risk an incompetent effort to fumble and destroy my scissor door in an amateur attempt to extricate me from my car. I pushed on the door and climbed out. He immediately pushed me up against the fender and spun me around. I heard and felt the clamps of hardened steel wrap around my wrists. "You are under arrest," he said. "For what?" I exclaimed in disbelief. "1 mile over," he said, "and other bigger infractions." "Like what?" I asked. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to the presence of an attorney, and if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you prior to any questioning." "This is outrageous," I exclaimed. He spirited me to the back seat of his cruiser, and there I waited. A tow truck arrived in minutes, thankfully of the flatbed variety, and my mental faculties stressed while the towman loaded her onto the back of the truck. The flatbed drove away with my prize as fast as they'd arrived, no doubt escorting her to the police pound. That particular thought made me more apprehensive about a possible teardown of my car in search of contraband that did not exist. "Where are they taking her?" I asked. "I'd worry less about your car and more about your situation," he snapped. He put his cruiser in drive and we left the shoulder, heading directly to the center of town. Upon entering the town's limits, I watched the locals, all eyes trained upon me, hostility oozing from their faces. We came to a stop at an old-style parking meter, a thing that seemed out of the 50s, and my mind wandered to the thought of acquiring one for my garage before leaving this tiny town, a town whose name I did not recognize. The handcuffs dug painfully into my wrists, and I notified the officer of the problem. He sneered at me and said nothing. He opened the door and hauled me out like a bundle of refuse with no regard for my rights. I decided to speak no more and exercise my Fifth Amendment privilege. The officer pointed me in the direction of the courthouse, an antiquated building, a thing chiseled out of the 1930s. I walked past townsfolk on their daily excursions to and from the city center, and I observed their dress codes to be, shall I say, out of code for the times. They wore unusual garb and to me were suggestive of a style that matched the age of the moldy old courthouse. What a bizarre little town! They looked at me with disdain, seeing my arms restrained behind me as if I were a common criminal, though I was dressed in decent casual clothing. "This way," pointed the officer, and we rounded a corner to ascend the courthouse steps. He pushed me along with a callousness that contravened the reputation of small towns for small town friendliness. Climbing those steps reminded me of climbing the steps to the gallows. I had such a bad feeling where this whole charade was headed. I could, in theory, even spend a night in jail, the way things were shaping up. He opened the courthouse door and pushed me further down the funnel of the legal system, removed my handcuffs, and processed me on the spot. I thought that bookings routinely occurred at a police station, but this little town somehow had integrated law enforcement with the actual courthouse, a most strange quirk for this bizarre little place. A second officer on scene took my photos, both front and side, and I stood aghast before the camera. Such buttoned-down law and order by the numbers, a ludicrous display of authority for a speeding ticket of but 1 mile per hour over the limit. They read me my rights once more, and then, when I expected to go free and recover my Countach, they marched me down 2 flights of stairs to a dark, dank prison cell under the main floor of the courthouse. The accompanying officer used an old rusty key to open the barred door and shoved me into the cell. He slammed the door and locked it tight. I wanted to say something to them, but I could not think with a clear mind. The shock of the situation overwhelmed me, and the impression of my situation took on a dire complexion well beyond my previous ill thoughts. The cell contained a mildewed cot and a hole in the floor to do my business. A solitary light bulb hung from the ceiling with a disgraceful output of the lowest wattage imaginable. The arrangement was positively medieval, a horror scene from some archaic nighttime documentary of the Middle Ages. Time dragged at a lethargic pace, the only company to keep my sanity and remind me that in fact I was not stuck in the Middle Ages was my faithful Heuer Monaco watch. It ticked away the hours into nightfall. My eyes heavy, I was left with 2 choices, either to sleep on the damp concrete or the mildewed cot. I opted for the cot and slept with my shirt over my nose to abate the horrid olfactory offense of the worn-out mattress. I drifted off and dreamed terrible landscapes of terror, frightful imaginings of inhuman beings threatening my untimely death. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the arresting officer stirred me from my fitful sleep, fumbling with that rusted key to open the door. I had the hope of release, having done my penance for the most minor of transgressions, but that was not to be. The door creaked open on its vile hinges, and he kicked me in my side to get me up. I stood and he cuffed me again. I was whisked upstairs and ushered to a courtroom, still half asleep and somewhat disoriented. When the bailiff opened the courtroom door, I saw the judge already seated on the bench, and the bailiff guided me to the defendant's table. The prosecutor sat opposite, and the officer uncuffed me. I rubbed my wrists to regain the circulation and awaited their next move. I deemed it imprudent to say another word until I could get a definitive idea how this grandiose spectacle might play out. A good part of me was more curious than fearful. The judge picked up a file and extracted what must have been the charges and began to read them aloud. "Mr. Burton, you have been charged by the people with a criminal indictment for speeding 1 mile per hour over the posted speed limit, and another criminal indictment for owning and driving an exotic car within the boundaries of Pike County. How plead you to the charges?" The second indictment rose to the level of utter absurdity, and at first I believed that I had misheard the charge. I stood up from my chair and asked for clarification, believing that my groggy state of being was the cause for the misapprehension of that second charge. "Your Honor, I can admit to the first charge, but the second charge, could you please repeat?" "So for the record, you are admitting to the first charge, am I correct?" said the judge. "Yes, but I did not catch that second charge." "Let me repeat for you, Mr. Burton, so there can be no further misunderstanding. You are charged with driving an exotic car within the boundaries of Pike County. How plead you to the second charge?" I heard the second charge. I did not want to believe the second charge, but I heard it clearly this time. I needed to think fast. "Well, Your Honor, what exactly is an exotic car? How do you define it?" "Mr. Burton, you will not be coy with this court. You know full well what an exotic car is, and you are the owner of one Lamborghini Countach, is that not true?" "True, Your Honor, but it's only a sports car. How do you define an exotic?" "Well, let's take a look at the statute, shall we?" The judge turned in his high-back leather chair and removed a book from the shelf behind him. He flipped through the volume and arrived upon a specific page, scanning it with his forefinger. "And here it is," he said. "Section 593.1 of Pike County's compiled statutes, which defines an exotic as any automobile that bears the mark of Ferrari, Lotus, McLaren, Koenigsegg, Bugatti, Pagani, Aston Martin, and most important, Lamborghini, to name a few more of this lengthy list." "This is insane. What kind of law is that?" "It's our law, Mr. Burton, and you are in breach of that law. I find you guilty on both counts." "Okay, now what?" I said. I sat down with folded arms and waited. "It is time for sentencing," said the judge. The courtroom clerk produced a large box from behind the bench and stepped up behind the judge. She opened the box and removed what looked to be like a large silver necklace. With much pomp and circumstance, she stood behind the judge and placed the necklace over the judge's robe. It clanged with a heavy ring of metal, the collective nameplates and emblems from the likes of Ferraris, Aston Martins, Porsches, Bugattis, and yes, Lamborghinis. They clinked around his neck with his every movement, a weighty chain of prior convictions, evidenced by a macabre display of many exotic nameplates of past legal victories. I could not help but wonder what happened to the owners. "This court hereby sentences you to death in the traditional way of this county, sentence to be carried out instanter by this court." The pronouncement left me dazed. 2 officers picked me up from the defendant's table and cuffed me. I had to say something, anything, to protest this travesty of justice. "I want my lawyer," I exclaimed. "Where's my due process? This is insane." "You will be silent," shouted the judge. "Remove this man from my sight." Law enforcement marshaled me from the courtroom and marched me down the courthouse steps to an idling police cruiser, an officer waiting with an open door to shove me inside, the same officer that nabbed me and started this descent into madness. "Are you people crazy?" I asked. The 2 officers said nothing, and one closed the rear door while the other assumed driving duty. A fear like no other had taken hold of my psyche, an inescapable sensation of dread at where we were headed. The cloak of night remained, and the spray of the cruiser's headlights led the way along a 2-lane road that eventually disintegrated into a gravel trail. The sound of flying pebbles beneath the cruiser's suspension rattled my thoughts, my senses on high alert, and my mind racing to think of a way to escape. The cuffs held my wrists firmly together behind my back. Even if I were capable of opening the door to roll out, I knew that I would not get far. The doors only opened outside, the interior handles conveniently removed to prevent such possibilities. I came to the realization that I was actually going to die. They were going to actually kill me, and no one would ever hear from me again. The cruiser came to a stop at a pair of rusted iron gates embellished with dragons, the gateway to a cemetery, the gateway to hell. The pre-dawn twilight allowed me to see the anonymous outlines of gloomy, deteriorated headstones. The driver silenced the cruiser's engine, making me acutely aware of my erratic heartbeat. The sudden vacuum of sound was interrupted by an opening door, and the second officer ushered me from the back seat. A cool mist hovered over the gravestones. With an absent-minded deviation from the utter immediacy of my impending death, I squinted to search for names on the headstones. Years ago, I'd lost a friend who mysteriously disappeared while out on a joyride in his new Ferrari. I never heard from him again, nor did anyone else. Was it possible that he ended up in this foul place? There were no discernible names, but rather engraved marks of automobiles, so-called exotic crests, and nameplates etched into the granite, names declared by the judge who cited his absurd statute. I turned away from the headstones to see my Lamborghini parked in the distance, squatting on a patch of grass in all her ubiquity. The officers pushed me in the direction of my car, shoving me so hard I struggled to regain my balance. I wanted to protest, but knew that words would make no difference. Up ahead, I saw a backhoe positioned next to my Countach, and I began to understand. They brought me to a halt at the back end of my Lamborghini. We all stood in silence. One officer removed my cuffs and handed me a butter knife, while the other removed his revolver and pointed it straight at me. Were they trying to set me up? To imply that I pulled a knife on them, and they had no choice but to blast me into oblivion? This was not to be the case. Another more evil intent lay behind the gesture. "Pull it off," said the officer with the gun. "Remove the nameplate." "What?" I said, incredulous that they wanted me to cause damage to my own car. The other officer kicked me hard and I doubled over. "You better do what he says," said his partner. I hobbled over to the back end of my car and eased the dull blade beneath the Lamborghini nameplate and pried it off. It hurt me to my core to desecrate my Countach, but my mind harkened back to the length of chain worn by the judge when he pronounced sentence. The Lamborghini nameplate was to be one of his trophies to adorn that silver chain. I held the nameplate in my hand, a tear streaming down my face at the indignity of my circumstances. His partner tore the Lamborghini namesake from my hand and took the knife away. "You're too slow," he said. He walked to the front of my car and pried off the Prancing Bull moniker and stuffed it in his pocket. "Get up," ordered his partner. I stood with weak legs, paralyzed with fear, and the cuffs were reintroduced to my wrists. And here I stand in this potter's field, waiting for the end. One of the officers opens a scissor door and orders me to get behind the wheel. I comply. He shuts the door tight, and I sit awkwardly in the driver's seat, my hands unable to take the helm if but for one last time. The backhoe operator fires up his machine and begins to break a wide expanse of ground. I gain clarity on the chosen method of my execution, a fitting way to go if I must leave this world. Man and machine, I will forever be united with my beloved Countach, a suitable tomb for eternity.